A verse-by-verse study in the book of 2 John, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter. What does 2 John chapter mean? 2 John is the shortest book in the Bible and has one chapter. This letter features only 13 verses. The book begins with a brief introduction in 2 John 1 verses 1 to 3 to the elect lady and her children. The meaning of this phrase is debated, though it likely refers to the particular local church receiving the letter. The phrase, her children, would include those believers influenced by this church, referring even to other churches. The introduction includes a strong focus on truth, mentioned 4 times in these first 3 verses, followed by a brief greeting, 2 John 1 verse 3. Verse 4 gives a commendation for those walking in the truth. This key verse stands as a theme in the letter. John notes, some of your children walking in the truth, indicating some were not. Christians are not immune to sin, or to spiritual error. It's important for believers to examine themselves, to be sure that what they say and do matches the truth. Part of John's letter warns against false teachers and those who followed them, 2 John 1 verses 7 to 11. Verses 5 and 6 focus on the commandment to love one another, 2 John 1 verse 5. Love includes, that we walk according to his commandments, this is the commandment. 2 John 1 verse 6. Love for God is closely connected with obedience to the truth. Verses 7 to 11 then focus on false teachers. John mentions many deceivers who claim Jesus did not come in the flesh or physically, 2 John 1 verse 7. He calls them the deceiver and antichrist, 2 John 1 verse 7. Believers were to watch themselves, 2 John 1 verse 8, and have no part in the evil work of such people, 2 John 1 verses 10 to 11. This is not the same as a difference of opinion, this is a matter of essential truth. Those who reject the core message of the gospel are to be avoided. Verses 12 and 13 conclude the short letter. John has more to write, but wants to meet in person to make his joy complete, 2 John 1 verse 12. He concludes with a statement about the children of your elect sister, a reference to the church where John was located at that time. Though concise, John's letter addresses important issues related to truth, love, false teachers, and the person of Christ. Chapter context. As a short letter, 2 John doesn't develop any one topic too deeply. John is pleased to see that some believers are sticking to the truth, but this implies that others are not. He is concerned over the influence of false teachers, using strong terms to reject their teachings. John's reference to the elect lady and her children is probably a reference to an entire local church and its members. Verse by verse. Verse 1. The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. The first 3 verses of this letter are an introduction. This begins with the author of the letter, described as the elder. The letter itself does not say exactly who this is. Tradition holds that the writer is the Apostle John. The evidence for his authorship is based on similarities with John's other writings, external evidence from church history, and the lack of any reasonable alternative. The letter is written to the elect lady and her children. There have been many different interpretations of this phrase. It may mean that John was writing to a particular Christian woman and her family. It may also refer to a particular woman and a church meeting in her home, a local church and those it has influenced, or the Christian church in general. Of these options, the most likely is that John is writing to a particular local church. This is especially likely since the letter's final verse mentions the children of your elect sister, a reference to the church of the author. John loved this church, in truth, as did all who know the truth. His focus on love and its close association with truth are evident in this letter. John intends to show that legitimate love has an accurate foundation, one distinctly different from false teachers. Context summary. 2 John 1 verses 1 to 3 introduces this letter, from the elder to the elect lady and her children. These are references to the disciple John, and some particular local church, respectively. As is typical in such letters, John refers to the grace of God, to Jesus Christ, and to the concepts of love and truth. Verse 2. Because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. John and other believers love the elect lady and her children, 2 John 1 verse 1, because of the truth. John again considers truth and love as inseparable qualities. This closely connects with Paul's teaching of speaking the truth in love, seen in Ephesians 4 verse 15. Christ-like love is based on accurate knowledge of God. As John continues this letter, he will discuss those who try to minister while teaching false ideas about Christ. Their failure proves his claims about truth and love. Truth is a quality which abides in us. This word includes the idea of remaining or continuing. It lasts and does not end or fade. In fact, this verse also says that truth will be with us forever. Truth is eternal, like God himself. John and other Christians love in truth, 2 John 1 verse 1, greet believers in truth, 2 John 1 verse 3, and John has joy over those walking in the truth, 2 John 1 verse 4. Verse 3. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us, from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father's Son, in truth and love. Verses 1 and 2 describe the letter's author and recipient. Verse 3 offers a greeting, completing the traditional three-part introduction common to letters in Greco-Roman culture. John refers to grace, mercy, and peace. Each of these qualities are found in believers, yet come from God. They also come from Jesus, who is the Son of God. The conclusion of this verse again ties love and truth together. John and other believers love in truth, 2 John 1 verse 1, because of the grace, mercy, and peace that come from God. John also closely links God the Father and God the Son, emphasizing their equal nature. Later, he will add details about the importance of Jesus coming in the flesh, 2 John 1 verse 7. Here, John simply states that Jesus is the Son of God and Christ. His term is from the Greek Christos, meaning anointed one. This, in turn, is from the Hebrew term for Messiah. Verse 4. I rejoiced greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. Verse 4 begins the main body of John's letter and is also the general theme of the text, John's joy at finding truth in the lives of some of the children. John is pleased at the growth of the believers in the church to which he writes. His use of the term greatly emphasizes his tremendous elation. This was news John had either heard or, more likely, had personally encountered. His joy was specific, relating to children walking in obedience to the truth of the gospel. This verse is also similar to 3 John 1 verse 4, which also mentions John's happiness at seeing Christians live according to their faith. These two letters, 2 John and 3 John, were probably written to a different audience, but share many similarities. This strengthens the case that the Apostle John wrote both. John then connects this obedience to its source, which is the command of God. This letter frequently references the Father-Son relationship within the Trinity. The introduction mentioned the Father and the Father's Son, 2 John 1 verse 3. Verse 9 will mention the teaching of both the Father and Son. A believer who trusts in Christ must also believe and obey the teachings of the Father. Context summary 2 John 1 verses 4 to 6 summarizes the theme of this letter, true Christian love. John is pleased to hear that some of the members of this church are walking in truth. This implies that some are not, and in later verses, John will warn about following false teachers. Here, John reminds the reader that showing love is the first and primary commandment given to a Christian believer. Verse 5. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. Verse 4 focused on obedience to truth. Verses 5 and 6 emphasize love. John now makes a request, again addressed to the "dear lady," a reference to the entire local church. What John is about to ask is not a new command, but something which has been part of their faith from the start. This beginning probably refers to Jesus' teaching in John 13 verses 34 to 35. There, he commanded us to love each other, so that we would be identified by love. Jesus would repeat this commandment in John 15 verse 12 and John 15 verse 17. Paul echoes it in Romans 12 verse 10 and 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 9. Peter mentions it in 1 Peter 1 verse 22. John mentions it repeatedly in his first letter, 1 John 3 verse 11, 4 verse 7, 4:11-12. Loving one another is obedience to the commandment of Jesus. It is so important that it's meant to be the primary way the world recognizes us as Christians, John 13 verse 35. Verse 6. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. This verse defines the kind of love John speaks of. Here, it means obeying God's commandments. Love is not merely an emotion, but requires actions based on truth. Here, the exact Greek word is agape, translated as love, specifically meaning a selfless focus on other people. John's use of it here certainly includes emotional aspects, but is much more specific than most modern definitions of love. The primary example of this kind of love is Jesus, who showed it through his life and actions. It includes loving one another as well as walking in obedience to God's truth. John re-emphasizes that this command is one the reader should already be familiar with. He repeats that loving one another is not optional, it is a command. Because it is a fundamental command connected to Jesus himself, believers are to walk in it or obey it. Attempting to love, apart from God's truth, is not legitimate, according to this letter. Verse 7. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. This verse begins a new section, extending through verse 11, which discusses false teachers. John begins by stating that there were not a few, but many deceitful teachers. In addition, they are not all in one place, but are spread out among the world. John's words were words of warning and caution. John then defines the attributes of these deceivers. First, they do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. These false teachers claim that Jesus came to earth spiritually, perhaps as an enlightened one, but was not a human like other people. This is false, as Scripture teaches Jesus was born of a virgin, with a physical body like that of any other human being. If Jesus was not a real person, he could not have physically died and resurrected. Both the humanity and deity of Christ are an essential part of his being. This is why John taught those who denied Christ's humanity are the deceiver and the Antichrist. They were speaking lies and were literally against Christ. Context summary 2 John 1 verses 7 to 11 discusses a certain type of false teacher. Those who deny that Jesus came to earth in a real, physical, human form are not teaching the truth. According to John, these people are not to be supported in any way whatsoever. Those who help a false teacher are participating in their sin. Verse 8. Watch yourselves, so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. The warning against false teachers was to watch yourselves. When believers encounter a false teacher, in this case one who denies Christ's humanity, they are not to be concerned with the false teacher's life or arguments. Instead, a Christian is to guard against those false teachings in their own lives. A believer's primary concern is their own spiritual life. The reason believers are to watch themselves when false teachers are near is also mentioned. Listening to a false teacher cannot cause a believer to lose his or her salvation, but can cause them to lose spiritual rewards. Why? because a deceived believer does not faithfully serve the Lord. He or she then loses out on possible heavenly treasures. The power of salvation is not simply gaining heaven and avoiding hell. It also means having the ability to live a righteous and godly life, but this is a power Christians can fail to take advantage of. John includes himself in this warning by stating, "We." Even this great apostle had to guard against false teachers and their teachings. Verse 9. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ, does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. Following his warning, John provides a way to identify false teachers. First, he notes that those who do not hold to sound teaching are worthy of doubt. In other words, if a person teaches something about Jesus himself which is grossly wrong, they cannot be considered a believer. True Christians may misunderstand or be ignorant of certain biblical teachings about Jesus. But those who completely misunderstand who Jesus really was, or who teach against the true identity of Jesus on purpose, are false teachers and unbelievers. In contrast, those who stay faithful to Christ's teachings should be trusted. The idea of abiding is again mentioned, 2 John 1 verse 2. A true believer will last in the faith, he or she will not later deny Christ and teach falsely about him. This verse may also help those who wonder about people who have appeared to be strong Christians and then later deny Christ or become aberrant in their faith. John says such people do not have the Son, in other words, they were never truly believers in Jesus. Verse 10. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. John builds on his teaching from verses 7 to 9 with a conditional statement. The teaching he refers to is the one that Jesus came in real, physical, human form, John 1 verses 1 to 14. The Gospel of John, written by this same author, strongly emphasizes that Jesus came from heaven to earth. He became flesh and dwelt among us, John 1 verse 14. Believers must accept that Jesus walked the earth as both divine and fully human. To deny this truth is to deny a core aspect of the gospel. According to John, those who rejected this truth were not to be given any support. If a traveling teacher, who did not accept the humanity of Jesus, came to this church, John commands separation. They are not to be given resources, hospitality, or any other help. Believers are not to associate themselves in any way with false teachers who deny the true identity of Jesus. The following verse offers an additional reason for John's command, where he refers to the danger of sharing in the evil of these false teachers. Verse 11. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. This verse concludes the main body of the letter and John's warnings against false teachers in verses 7 to 11. John's comment is both direct and powerful. A person who shows hospitality to false teachers takes part, or shares, in that sin. In the context of this culture, John has in mind a person who accepts a false teacher into his or her home. This does not mean in a modern, literal sense that a believer cannot say, hello, or good morning, to a false teacher. The idea is to avoid anything that even slightly supports a false teacher's work. John's desire was for believers to walk in the truth, 2 John 1 verse 4, not to share in wicked work or evil. This means more than simply not doing evil ourselves. As believers, we are also called on to avoid supporting those who teach some other, false gospel, Galatians 1 verse 8. Being polite and loving does necessarily mean advocating or defending. We are not to confuse civility with promoting those who preach a dangerous and phony message. Verse 12. Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. Verses 12 and 13 conclude the letter of 2 John. John was a prolific writer, 3 John 1 verse 13. He composed the Gospel of John, the letters of 1, 2, and 3 John, and the book of Revelation. Altogether, the Apostle John authored 50 of the New Testament's 260 chapters. He certainly could have written a longer letter. This, however, is not his purpose in this message. Despite his writing talent, John prefers personal contact. He uses a Greek phrase almost always translated as face-to-face. The phrasing is stoma pro stoma, which literally means mouth to mouth. The idea is two people directly communicating without any barriers or distance. It means to speak in person, directly. Personal visits have a different importance, and a different feel, to distance communication. This is still true even after development of new technologies. Having the opportunity to meet face-to-face would make John extremely happy. Context summary: 2 John 1 verses 12 to 13 concludes the letter of 2 John. John could have written much more, but this is not the purpose of the letter. His preference is to meet face-to-face, something he hopes will occur. The use of family terminology is common in Christian writing. John also refers, again, to an elect sister, suggesting that this is a letter from one Christian church to another. Verse 13. The children of your elect sister greet you. This final verse of 2 John is a very brief signature. The children referred to are almost certainly the believers with John in his current location. We aren't sure if John is with a few Christian friends or an entire church, but he is clearly in touch with some type of Christian community. This is in contrast to the book of Revelation, which John wrote while alone in exile on Patmos, Revelation 1 verse 9. In Revelation, John is alone and hearing directly from the Lord. These fellow believers were spiritual family with the recipients of John's letter. Using terms such as children and sister implies relationship. John is using familial terms for believers in his location and those receiving his writing. These fellow Christians send greetings, which are simple positive blessings to those they could not visit in person at the time. Still today, believers often send greetings to one another while apart. Likewise, we long to see one another in person, view one another as family, and anticipate eternity together with Christ. The reference to the sister in this verse is a strong reason to think that the elect lady mentioned earlier in this letter is an entire church or community, rather than a single person. Book summary: 2 John is one of the disciple John's letters. The others are 1 John and 3 John. He is also the author of the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation. Letters such as this help us understand John's guidance of early churches. As the last surviving disciple, John's words would have carried great weight in the Christian community. End of chapter 1 and the book of 2 John. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.